Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery, Part 2. Well, if the phrase last but not least was ever apropos, well, this is one of those examples. This is the final movie of the CISA Nugget series, and I know that the temptation is to just blow through this last movie so you can complete the process. But remember, my recommendation to you was that you go through this entire CISA series twice. The second time, right before you take the exam. So that being said, each one of these movies is vitally important. And although business continuity and disaster recovery only makes up about 10% of the exam, it's that 10% that may put you over the edge. Also, the concepts covered in this Nugget movie are extremely important to the lifeblood and success of your organization from a real-world standpoint. So I want to make sure that you really focus carefully on all the points that we cover in this final Nugget movie. Take a deep breath, gather your second wind as we approach the finish line. In this final Nugget movie of the CISA series, we're going to look at disaster recovery and business continuity part 2, where we'll look at organizing our responsibilities, the different types of teams, assigning these different teams and the membership. We'll look at several different components of BCP, business continuity planning. And then finally, we'll wrap up the auditor's responsibilities and objectives as we look at the big picture as it relates to the auditor and disaster recovery and business continuity. We'll also show you several organizations that can help you with business continuity management. I don't want to get political here on you because I'm a lover, not a fighter, but you've heard the concept, it takes a village from somewhere. And when it comes to auditing this process of business continuity and disaster recovery, especially on the enterprise level, you know what? It does take a village. It takes a wide variety of different teams involving different skill sets, different committees to get this whole thing in place. Now, once you have the teams and the committees and they do their job, hopefully this can be a process of just maintaining this on, let's say, a quarterly basis. But you should identify as an auditor all the different groups, all the different skill set teams and their assigned responsibilities that are put in place to mitigate in case of an incident or a disaster. Now, there's a wide variety of teams with different kinds of names, and these aren't hard and fast rules, but you may have a majority of these teams at your organization, you may have a subset of these teams, but typically you'll have what are called incident response teams or emergency action teams or damage assessment teams. These are people that are designated to get all the information about each incident, to document it, look at all the vulnerabilities and threats to assets and processes. They're going to generate reports that go to management. These are typically the first response, okay, the first response team. Think of, the fire monitor at school when you were growing up, or if you look at, let's say, a team of firefighters, it's the fire wardens and the bucket crews. They're the first ones on hand when there's a crisis, okay? Incident response, emergency action, damage assessment teams. So the individual or individuals who decide whether this is a full-blown crisis or not, they're definitely going to be members or leaders of those teams. You may call this an emergency management team, responsible for coordinating the recovery and decision-making process, handling legal matters from the outset of a disaster, public relations, media inquiries, making sure that you activate the business continuity plan. So you may have a combination of these teams, or maybe you just got one all-encompassing team. Typically, though, you're going to break down into smaller teams in order to modularize the process to make sure that all of your bases are covered. Maybe you've got a team that just deals with the off-site storage. Maybe they're the ones that manage the hot sites or the warm sites or the cold sites, or the ones that manage the storage and the maintenance of the equipment. You may have what's called an emergency operations team. These are the people who actually reside at the systems recovery sites, at the hot sites or the warm sites. They manage system operations during an emergency, during the disaster recovery project. Maybe you're going to specialize these individuals into different categories of software and applications, security teams, network recovery teams, people that deal strictly with the network infrastructure and bandwidth and telephony. This may work hand in hand with a communications team. Maybe they travel to the recovery site and work with the network recovery team to establish that user and system network. They deal with local exchange carriers, gateway vendors, ISPs, telecoms. Maybe you've got a transportation team. How are you going to move personnel and equipment, okay, in an emergency? Do you have access to buses, vans, those types of things? Maybe you have people that requisition supplies for this particular activity. Again, you could break this down into a granular fashion, just user hardware as opposed to server hardware. You've got the data people that do the data preparation on the main site and also have the ability to move that data, migrate that data, replicate that data, copy and recover that data at the off-site location. Maybe you've got a team that's just put together for administrative support. They just deal with middle management and team leaders. Maybe they're the interface between upper management and middle management. Maybe you have a team that's responsible for salvage, okay? After the incident occurs, what's left over at the site? They go in after the fact, after the disaster, and they're able to salvage and restore and relocate whatever's available. This team may actually be, since it's kind of an after the fact thing, this may actually be one of the duties of one of these other teams, maybe the emergency action team. Also, after the emergency goes in, and they're part of the salvage and restoration and relocation process. Maybe a team of managers who are coordinators and testing of this entire process. A team of trainers for awareness for disaster recovery. And of course, a team of people, typically lawyers, who can handle the legal and the government affairs. So really, it just kind of gives you this concept as an auditor to make sure that you have this village in place of different teams and committees and groups that are ready pre-disaster, pre-crisis to handle almost any emergency that comes along. You should already be pretty aware of the business continuity planning, but there are several components you need to be aware of. These are kind of some industry acronyms that kind of go along with the BCP process. I want to make sure that you understand these different terms as they relate to BCP. First of all, you've got the business recovery plan, which takes into consideration all of the aspects of recovery that we've talked about in the previous nugget, and the ones we're going to talk about in this nugget, including backup and restore processes and disaster planning. There's also what's called a continuity of operations plan. This refers to the preparations and the components usually used by government agencies. This goes hand in hand with the U.S. government that provides survival of government operations in case of catastrophic events. So whenever you see this COOP, you want to think of a government organization. And this is really kind of Cold War think tank type of stuff. But you can find information about this on the internet. Also, from a IT standpoint, you have an IT contingency plan, and this revolves backup for the network infrastructure, for services, for applications, for end users, failover, redundancy, all those issues. Maybe a crisis communications plan. Just making sure that you have a readily available database in hard copy of all of the addresses, the phone numbers, the contact people in your organization and without of your organization that you can communicate with in case of an emergency. This would also include all the potential ways to contact these people. I mean, all the way down from cellular phone numbers to instant messaging to shortwave radio capabilities, as well as their physical addresses. As an auditor, you want to make sure that you have an incident response plan in place. This is part of the BCP, making sure that you have a step-by-step printed and published process for responding to emergencies and incidents. And of course, finally, the DRP, the Disaster Recovery Plan. These are all components of the BCP. You know, in part one of business continuity and disaster recovery, I alluded to protection and continuity of the network infrastructure and some of these concepts. I want to break these down a little bit more for you. And these are network protection methods, starting with redundancy. And redundancy involves a wide variety of solutions, which means additional capacity for network circuits, backup circuits, dynamic routing protocols like EIGRP and OSPF that have failover and redundancy capabilities, multiple redundant paths between routers within and without of your organization, failover devices to avoid single points of failures in routers, switches, multi-layer switches, firewalls, and other network appliances. These appliances should also have redundant power supplies built in as well, and if possible, redundant power sources. You also want to have copies of configuration files for all these devices stored in a secure fashion on a TFTP server. This should also be a redundant solution as well. Redundancy is extremely important. It's the backbone of not only network protection, but application server protection as well. I mentioned alternative routing mechanisms. This should be backup circuits, whether it's backup dial-up circuits through ISDN, maybe backing up your analog circuits with some fiber technology, using wireless or satellite as a backup. Alternative route methods to support your network infrastructure. You can also have diverse routing, which means routing traffic through multiple facilities, multiple service providers, multiple vendors. Long-haul network diversity means in a wide area network or a metropolitan area network, or dealing with remote offices, branch offices, and partnerships over large geographic areas, you want to have long-haul network diversity. This would be several major long-distance carriers, several redundant lines to the backbone of the global internet. Last-mile circuit protection means providing a redundant combination of local carriers, let's say T1 lines, microwave, or coax cable access to the local communications loop. And then, of course, many organizations will, especially financial and retail organizations who depend so much on voice, will have multiple voice communications, redundant cabling, and redundant voice over IP solutions. You know, we talked about redundancy with your network-enabled devices and appliances, but what about redundancy solutions for those very important workstations and servers that provide all the functionality in our distributed network? Well, this is where RAID comes in, or redundant array of independent or inexpensive disks. This is going to give us not only recovery capabilities and fault-tolerant capabilities through hardware and software, but also performance enhancements as well. What these big devices can do is they can partition the data and reading and writing of the data to a series of multiple disks to simultaneously provide failover capabilities and performance improvements. RAID is really kind of a generic term for data storage schemes or mechanisms that partition or replicate data across multiple hard drives. And depending upon the scheme, they offer increased data reliability, redundancy, and or throughput. Now, most of these schemes are referred to as levels. So you can see here we've got RAID level 0, RAID level 1, RAID level 5, RAID level 6. These are the most popular. And then we have what are called nested levels, where you combine RAID 0 plus 1, RAID 1 plus 0, RAID 5 plus 0, RAID 5 plus 1. Now, as an auditor, you don't have to really be an expert in these different types of RAID, but let me just give you a quick overview here. RAID 0 is referred to as striping or a striped set. You have to have at least 2 disks, and it doesn't provide parity, which means no fault tolerance from disk errors or disk failure. So RAID 0 is typically a performance improving mechanism and adding additional storage. RAID 1, however, is mirroring. You need at least 2 disks. This is mirroring without parity. So mirroring does provide fault tolerance from disk errors and failure from a single disk. RAID 5 is a very popular solution. It's called a striped set with parity or a striped set with distributed parity. And this distributed parity means you have to have all but one drive to be available to operate. If one drive goes down, the entire array of disks is not a failure. Now, what this parity information does is, if one of the drives fails, any subsequent reads from this array can be calculated from the distributed parity information so that the drive failure is masked from the end user. This gives the administrator time to replace that drive. And if we go back to that diagram I showed you earlier, those disk arrays, those are typically RAID 5 arrays or combinations like RAID 5 plus 0 and RAID 5 plus 1. RAID 5 plus 0, for example, is a stripe across distributed parity RAID systems, where RAID 5 plus 1 is a mirrored stripe set with distributed parity. In those larger, higher-end RAID arrays are typically combinations of 5 and 1 or 5 and 0. Now, these redundancy solutions through RAID typically are going to be software-based, Some network operating systems like Windows 2000, 2003, for example, have software RAID capabilities that basically work with your existing hard drives. Or they could be hardware solutions, or they can be some combination of software and hardware. Typically, a hybrid solution, which are very popular, combine multiple hard drives and disk controllers with software management systems. These may also support what are called hot spares or hot swapping, so that if one of the drives goes down, you can on the fly add another drive in there and recalculate from the parity information. The bottom line is this: from a redundancy solution for your application servers, mission critical servers, you want to have this redundant array of inexpensive or independent disks in the organization. Here's an interesting concept. As an auditor, you might want to make sure that your organization that you're auditing, or your own company or your customer, has insurance. And this is a very broad topic, but from a disaster recovery standpoint, just like you would have disaster recovery for in case of a flood or tornado or hurricane on your own home, you might want to have insurance for your organization. And this means a wide variety of coverages for facilities, for large end equipment, for reconstruction of software and your licensing. Insurance that covers valuable documentation, for example. Typically, this might be stored in bank safe deposit boxes or in off-site storage locations, but you want to insure that as well. You want to insure your company for legal errors and omissions based on a crisis or a disaster. And of course, fidelity coverage, which you typically find in a financial institution. But this is kind of bankers, bonds, fidelity insurance, commercial blanket bonds that covers loss from fraudulent acts or dishonest employees. So another thing about auditing, make sure your organization has insurance in place. Well, now that you have your hands and your arms around this BCP process, this business continuity planning, it wouldn't be complete without an elaborate testing strategy. Now, what should testing of BCP accomplish? Well, you want to make sure that the business continuity plan is complete and precise. You want to evaluate the performance of the people involved in the BCP process. You want to appraise how comprehensive the training and awareness is for employees and members of the business continuity teams we mentioned earlier. You want to evaluate the working relationship between the teams and the external vendors and suppliers and partners. Measure the ability and capacity of the backup site, whether it be hot sites, warm sites, or cold sites, to perform as planned. You want to access the capabilities of retrieving vital records. You want to evaluate the state and the quantity of the equipment and the supplies that have been relocated. Again, this is going to be a pilot test of this disaster process. You're going to measure the overall performance. Now, in the testing process, you have really kind of three phases: a pre-test, a test, and a post-test, with documentation all along the way. The pre-test is basically setting the stage for the actual test. The set of actions that includes printing out the step-by-step procedures, prepping the operations recovery areas, transporting and installing backup systems. Then the test, of course, is the real action of the business continuity test. And then, of course, post-test is cleaning up the activities, getting reports from the groups, from the teams, assessing the performance, and then implementing any changes. Also, in the post-test activities, you're going to analyze the results. You're going to analyze these results in terms of time, okay? The amount of time it took and the amount of time spent at the backup site. Count the number of records that were created for all of the variables in the backup plan, the amount of work performed, and the accuracy of the data. All these things are part of the analysis of your testing result. And then, of course, all along the way, you're going to reevaluate and maintain this testing process by improving it all along the way. You may want to include some type of software tool like Microsoft's Project to administer the continuity and recovery plans and to help all the individuals along the way. Experienced project managers with PMP certifications would be good additions to the various teams. As we wrap up this Nugget movie and subsequently the entire CISA series, let's kind of get the big picture here for auditing disaster recovery and business continuity, remember, we want to guarantee, if possible, continuous service of our organization. So the BCP should be written to minimize the effect of disruptions, disasters, and crises. So this plan should be based on long-range information technology planning, and it needs to mesh with the overall business continuity strategy. So our goals here are really to prepare the business impact analysis for the loss of critical business processes, to identify and prioritize systems, as well as resources that are necessary to support the critical business processes, and choose the right strategies for recovering at least to a baseline of activity where you can keep the business going until full facilities are available. You want to develop a detailed plan, a disaster recovery plan for recovering information system facilities, a detailed plan for critical business functions, test the plans, as we talked about, and maintain the plans. Remember that our business is going to change, our systems are going to develop. This is a living, breathing organism. So as an auditor, your tasks are to understand and evaluate the business continuity strategy and how it is aligned with business objectives, evaluate the plans, determine their adequacy, how often they should be reviewed, verify the plans that are effective, review the results from tests, and implement the changes. Evaluate the off-site storage solutions. Evaluate backup and recovery solutions. Evaluate the ability of the IS department and end users to effectively respond in emergency situations. So you're going to review the emergency procedures, review the training manuals, and the drills that take place. This is a key aspect of your auditing process. Again, you're going to review the overall business continuity process and business continuity plan. You will evaluate the processes, evaluate the prior test results, and evaluate the present test results. As I mentioned, evaluate the solutions, the off-site storage, security at the off-site facility as well. Review all the contracts and relationships with vendors and providers. Make sure you review all the key components of disaster recovery and business continuity. Now, with that being said, as an auditor, you have to continually revisit and improve upon these business continuity processes. It's going to be critical to the development of successful and robust recovery strategies for your organization or for your customer's organization. So what you want to do is you want to have as part of your database and some of your daily correspondence some of the main practices and industry-independent and industry-specific guidelines from organizations and regulatory agencies. So let me give you kind of a laundry list here of organizations. You can visit their website. You can do more research on these, kind of a homework project of all these different organizations that you want to be in touch with to help you complete your disaster recovery and business continuity education. To further your portfolio and your study of business continuity management, or BCM, there's several organizations you should be aware of. There's the BCI, the Business Continuity Institute, which is going to give good best practices for business continuity management. There's the NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Agency. You might want to check them out and add them to one of your browser favorites. I already mentioned FEMA, F-E-M-A, the Federal Emergency Management Association. This is good guidelines for business and industry emergency management. You've got the FFIEC, which is the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council. HIPAA, which is for health insurance and privacy for the healthcare industry. You've got the FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And finally, to get professional practices for business continuity professionals, check out the DRII, Disaster Recovery Institute International. Well, there you have it, Disaster Recovery and Business Continuity Part 2. That completes the CISA Nugget series. Again, I want to highly recommend, if this is your first time through this series, to go back through it again right before you take your CISA exam, outline each one of these slides, and take very, very detailed notes. On behalf of CBT Nuggets and myself, Michael Shannon, I want to wish you success as an IS and IT auditor. I want to wish you success on the CISA examination. And most of all, I want to wish you the best of success in your career and in your future. On behalf of the CBT Nuggets family, thank you for choosing us as your training solution.